And now I am going to move on to the other part of this stream where I have this thing in my brain that tells me if I'm going to do streaming, if I'm going to like do a thing where I say things into a camera and make noise about things, woo, noise, woo, I am going to make it about something real and something that matters. And I'm going to have a YouTube channel that has things that damn well matter on it. So with that, this is time for the stream chatterbox part of the day, as I chose to call it, where I pick out one thing that has happened recently that deserves our goddamn attention. And I start giving it a little bit of attention before I go away forever and ever and ever until tomorrow, but you know, for almost ever. So in this case, I live in British Columbia in Canada. And I find that there's a thing about Canada where both people who are in Canada and people who are not in Canada seem to have this idea that Canada is a paradise of sorts. Seem to have this idea that Canada doesn't have the horrific racial inequities and systemic racism that our brothers to the south have. And that is not in the least bit true, as it turns out. So what has happened is back in June, I think it was June. When is this article from? July 9th in, where are we? Yes. This is the Victoria newspaper, the provincial capital, and it's reporting on in Surrey Memorial Hospital. Surrey is the second biggest city in BC. It's a suburb of Vancouver. There was a game apparently played by ER doctors where they did a little Price is Right thing, guessing but not going over the blood alcohol content of Indigenous people who they had taken blood work on in this hospital. So that is an ugly thing. And it shone a light on something that everyone who lives here should damn well know from a lifetime of living here. And that's that we have a horrific problem with systemic racism in this country and this province. In fact, Canada is kind of remarkable in the sense that we're one of the very few places where our government has committed a full-on genocide of a group of a part of our population within living memory. We think about the colonial genocide of Indigenous peoples as something that is ancient history. But in fact, the government of Canada, in league with the Catholic Church, was still trying to wipe away Indigenous culture as late as, the 60s into the 70s and through the residential school system. So our society is full of people who grew up being kidnapped from their parents, having their culture literally beaten out of them by nuns. And many children died as a result of the inhumane punishments that they received for refusing to denounce their culture. That's only a small little scraping of Canada's insane racist history. So the Fraser Health Authority, which is the greater Vancouver sort of suburban health, better health, best in care, acknowledged these allegations, said racism has no place in our hospitals, and that they were going to study it. Now, I'm going to take a little step back and talk a little bit about Canada's race problem in a general sense. This is a Maclean's article. Maclean's is a little bit like the Canadian version of Time magazine. It's just this really old magazine that's pretty well respected, and people generally listen to it, and it has kind of a real liberal centrist kind of bent. It's very in the middle. Which isn't really a compliment, but okay. And this article had this neat little chart here where it compares measurable indicators of Canada's Aboriginal population against America's Black population. And it's true that the homicide rate is lower. It's about half, because frankly, America has a homicide rate that dwarfs any other wealthy country in the world. But pretty well, and incarceration is kind of similar, but pretty well every indicator you can see, from life expectancy to schooling statistics, dropout rate, to income, pretty much every measurable category, Canada's racism problem, systemic racism problem, seems to come out ahead, behind, whatever it is. Even this incarceration rate, which, you know, obviously the incarceration of Black Americans is absolutely straight up horrific. Like straight up horrific. America has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Possibly North Korea might be higher, maybe not. We don't know. Either way, it's top 2. That's pretty damn awful. But look at this. Aboriginal Canadians 10 times more likely to be incarcerated than not even than white Canadians, than Canadians in general. And the incarceration rate of Aboriginal Canadians is 2/3 African Americans. We don't think that we have a massive prison system. We don't think we have a prison industrial complex in Canada. We don't think we practice mass imprisonment in Canada, but look at this. We clearly do. Our problems are horrific and they're awful. So there was an independent investigation, and and it was set up to determine the extent of the anti-Indigenous racism in BC's healthcare system. Again, back in July, they set this up. And there's been a lot of studies about a lot of systemic racist problems, and they almost always come back saying, oh yeah, there's horrific systemic racism in Canada. Because repeat it after me, there is horrific systemic racism in Canada that we need to fucking change. There isn't even drinking water in a lot of reservation communities, and it's fucking disgusting. So the report came back yesterday. That's why I'm covering it today, because this is news. Yesterday, the report came back. And the report said that, let's scroll down a bit here. They interviewed almost 9,000 patients and healthcare workers. They found that 84% of Indigenous patients had experienced racism in healthcare. 84%. And usually when these kind of self-reporting studies happen, there tends to be a part of the group that reports, like, okay, you will never get, even something that's 100% true, you will not get 100% self-report. An 84% self-report is massive, because there will always be a percentage that underreport. That's the trouble with self-reporting, right? Meanwhile, more than 50% of Indigenous healthcare workers reported experiencing racism on the job, mostly from their own colleagues. This is Canada's model healthcare system, people. Now, this is disgusting. A startling 13% of surveyed healthcare workers of all races also made racist comments in response to the survey. 13% got a survey trying to determine if there was racism in the healthcare field, and responded with not just structural, not just subtle, not just halfway hidden racism, but racism that's so overt that it got recorded as their response to the survey. So there's this thing that we see when we read an article like this, where people in Canada who have experienced racism here, or who know people who have experienced racism here, or who pay attention to the news or statistics or studies and see the clear racism, or who read Maclean's. None of us should be surprised by this. The question is, what the fuck are we going to do about it? Because it's disgusting, and if you're not disgusted by it, fuck you. Okay? So what are we going to do about it? Let's read on. Racism isn't an Indigenous person's problem. That is true. It's up to us to solve it. So the Premier offered an apology to all Indigenous people who experienced racism while seeking care, and vowed to formulate a cross-government plan to implement the recommendations rooted in anti-racism and cultural humility. So that's better than nothing? Probably. It's up to Indigenous people whether they can accept the apology today. Here's the thing. An apology And the idea to implement a plan to acknowledge the pain. And where were we? We just read this. The recommendations are rooted in anti-racism and cultural humility. These are wonderful things. These are ways that people can learn the error of our society, where our society fails. There are ways we can look in the mirror. There are lenses through which we can see the problem. But they aren't solutions. They're important, but I'll tell you what solutions are. There are things like saying we are going to funnel money into Indigenous communities that we have systemically discriminated against for generations, that we have robbed of their cultural identity. And more important than that, we will recognize the sovereign right of BC's Indigenous people to their unceded territories. We will stop trying to force industry onto their territories, which they never signed over in treaties. We will stop treating them as though their concerns are something that can be addressed by apologizing and saying, we're going to undergo sensitivity training. That'll fix it. We need to have a serious dialogue in this province about respecting a nation-to-nation relationship between our Indigenous people and the settler population, built on respect, not built on this notion of apologizing and trying to remember things. Because that may be a first step, and that's all it calls it here, is a first step. But I've seen this step happen over and over again. This step was happening when I was a kid. This step was happening when, like, decades ago. We were apologizing decades ago. We were talking about, how we need to do better decades ago. And we didn't fucking do better. So it's time to do better.